Hello. When I was in college, I had a professor, David Schatz. Professor Schatz was his name. And he was the Russian literature professor. And David Schatz, this was back in the 1970s, and Professor Schatz was really into structural literary theory, structuralism. Structuralism, a kind of literary theory that he was really into. And he used to talk about structuralism in class a lot. I have to tell you, I never really did understand what literary structuralism was much. However, the thing about the class, the Russian literature class that I took with him, was that I discovered these wonderful, wonderful writers from the golden age of Russian literature. One of my very favorite writers of all time, in fact, is one of the writers that we're going to cover today. So let's get to it because it's literature, so you got to talk about it. And we're going to look at this wonderful, oopsie, golden age of Russian prose, which is the 19th century, the 1800s. And we're going to look at the historical context of that. And then we're going to take a look at some of the major writers there. Russia, I guess the other thing I'd say before we start is this. Russia is an extremely literate country. Russia has a very vital tradition of poetry and plays and prose. They have always been taken very seriously in Russia. And Russia has always had a huge reading public. So I think when we look at, the various Russia's kind of like the United States. It's in some ways a slightly skitsy country because it's sort of a European developed country and it's sort of not. And I think you can say the same thing as I say about North America, as you can say about Russian, Slavic Eurasia that way. So that's something to look at, I guess. But Russian literature of the 19th century, as we will see, has a particular flavor, a particular kind of character that really is like no other literature. And so that's something that distinguishes. It's like the Latin American novel of the 20th century that way. And it's also really fun literature in a very black humor, subversive and absurdist kind of way, just as that Spanish literature of a later century is. All right, so let's set it up a little bit then. So you have the Enlightenment, the 18th century, 1700s, and there were some of the Tsarist rulers, notably Peter the Great and then Catherine the Great, were influenced by the Enlightenment. A lot of this literature that we're looking at, this 19th century Russian literature, you'll notice, takes place in St. Petersburg, Florida. Florida, say, oh my gosh. St. Petersburg shows you where my mind is. St. Petersburg, Russia. Don't get on the wrong plane. So St. Petersburg, Russia, built by Peter the Great, because Peter the Great really wanted to get the ideas of the Enlightenment and European ideas into Europe. And he saw St. Petersburg as a kind of gateway. And St. Petersburg did function that way in the 19th century. And among other things, that it became a sort of bastion of these Enlightenment ideas, what at the time were the liberal ideas coming into the country. But then St. Petersburg in the 19th century was one of the places where the contradictions, the internal contradictions of sort of Russian national evolution at that point were most severe. A lot of this is taking place during the reign of Nicholas II in the early part of the 19th century. And what you have after the Napoleonic Wars, the defeat of the French in the Napoleonic invasion of Russia in 1812, then you have inevitably a sort of tightening up and the beginning of the Tsars being aware, very much as the Bourbons were aware in France in the 18th century. In the 19th century, the Romanovs are aware in Russia that they must make social reforms, that they are in a bit of a race against the clock, and that there will be bad consequences if they don't manage to modernize. A big problem for all Russian leaders, mostly because of the geography of the country, has always been modernization. So So you have then an authoritarian government. You have a fairly authoritarian government that's very uptight about maintaining control of things, and in particular maintaining control of ideas. One of the reasons, of course, Russia is a literate country that values literature very highly. Literary activity is always important in Russia, but in the 19th century, with shifting ideas and particularly these revolutionary European ideas running around, it was very important. And then you also get the abolition of the serfdom in 1861. The serfs are peasants who are tied to the land. They are part of the property of the estate. In fact, can be bought and sold. It's essentially slavery, peonage was practiced here until roughly the time of the American Civil War, when African slavery was abolished in, ethnic slavery was abolished in North America. And so what's happening, I say here on the slide then, it's the pre-revolutionary century, just like the 1700s is France's pre-revolutionary century. And at the end of the 1700s, in 1789, you get the French Revolution, everything goes boom. At the beginning of the 20th century, in Russia, everything goes boom. With a general revolution, there are factions in this revolution. It takes a number of years. Finally, the Red faction, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seized power in 1917. And indeed, just as Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were executed in 1869, actually, then also the year after 1917, 1918, the whole Romanov family, the wife and the daughters and the whole family are assassinated, and that's the end of the Romanovs, who had actually been the ruling power, the ruling family in Russia since the 17th century, 1600s. So why is all of that important? Why is all of that good context for looking at the literature of the century? Because what we see here is these ideas. There are great changes in the air. There are schisms and internal tensions these writers are aware of. You can sort of feel it coming. And indeed, it is a golden age of Russian literature. I mentioned in the early 1800s, this period, you have the Romantic movement. The Russians are very gritty, very urban. And so you don't think of them as romantic, but if you look at romantic in terms of talking about the alienation of the individual, the new problem in the post-industrial urbanized world of the alienation of the individual, in the case of the weird hybrid Russia exacerbated by the continuation of Tsarist control. So you've got the urban side and you've got sort of the countryside. And roughly, when we look here at 19th century, we can say that we're going to look at 4 writers today. And we could say Gogol and Dostoevsky, I would say, are kind of what I would call urban dystopians, looking at sort of the cracking up of individuals under the pressure of bureaucratization and industrialization, and as well as the bad economy of Russia, which isn't being well run. And then you have nationalists, who I would call the pastoralists in the sense that they sort of appeal to an old mother Russia in the countryside, where you can find the values that we need to get us through these changing times. A somewhat reactionary. Both of these movements are reactionary in the sense that they're reacting against these tremendous changes that are occurring. I say in the last bullet point on the slide there, it's kind of like Cervantes. That is, Russia in the 19th century is a country with its feet in 2 worlds, its feet in the past and its feet in the future. It's got one foot in slavery, just as in the United States, and the other foot in all of these Enlightenment ideas, just as in the United States. And you have the question of the czar. So you get this kind of dislocating effect, and sometimes very surrealistic effects, as in our first author, who will be Nikolai Gogol. I really like him. He's in my category with, I would say, Jonathan Swift, of sort of remarkably creative writers. And he is an early surrealist. Remember, surrealism we associate with painters like Salvador Dali at the beginning of the 20th century, about 100 years after this. But when we look at any definition of surrealism, Gogol certainly fits the definition. He uses hallucinogenic imagery and abrupt shifts to create these effects of dislocation and unreality. And in particular, there's a Russian word, I don't know how to pronounce it, ostraneni. It's the second bullet point on the slide there. Making strange, or the defamiliarization of the commonplace, taking an ordinary place. These are urban realist tales. He was considered a realist, even though I wouldn't say he was, but in the sense of the social realism that certainly characterizes all of the Russian literature of the century. But one of the things that this technique, again, you can associate with early 20th century art like Dada art, is Duchamp, that kind of thing, is it tries to get new responses instead of habitual responses. We're used to reacting to things in sort of habitual, conventionalized ways. And by juxtaposing ordinary objects into strange situations or having strange events intrude into ordinary situations, then you get this kind of defamiliarization effect. One thing about absurdity, I think absurdity carves out a kind of space for the artist to make statements. The absurdist says, look, I'm not going to follow these sort of standard rules of logic and argument in the first place. And a couple of things are implicit in that. One thing that's implicit in that, I think, is a challenge to authority. That is, well, you say that you say that you're in touch with reality, but I'm not sure. And also an appeal to feeling and an appeal to the people's humanity. I mean, what happens when Alice in Wonderland is talking to rabbits and growing 100 feet tall and getting in all these unreal situations is that we're looking at her as a human character in those situations. So surrealism, in sort of the European sense, last bullet point there, I would also say, and we'll see this when we get to the Irish literature of James Joyce, when we talk about modernist literature as well. In 19th century Russia, you have an old world, a rural world, and you have a new world that's sort of been juxtaposed on top of it. You have a sort of European sensibility over an old, more Asiatic sensibility, or what would be called Oriental in this context. So you have on top of the veneer that the cultural authorities impose, you have a kind of bubbling up of stuff underneath. Again, think of that magical realism of Latin America or African literature, which also will always be very folkloric on one side. Okay, so Gogol is like this, and this makes him remarkable, and particularly if you have a taste for this kind of thing. He publishes the Petersburg Tales in 1835, always talking about marginalized young men on the make, usually in from some provincial city. Maybe they've just got their college degree or something like that, and they sorry about that, and they are trying to make it, but often sort of not making it in St. Petersburg. And, I mean, part of the sort of humanism of Gogol, I think, is that he sees that an ordinary person, ordinary man needs the respect from other people, has to have some kind of sense of some sort of social status or the other. And the real brutality of a society that doesn't afford that to these young men, these young adults. And of course, everybody else has terrible problems as well, because it's also very cruel and merciless kind of poverty in a city where the rich people are nearby. So you have Diary of a Madman, an excellent depiction of someone sliding into madness, something that's characteristic of these Russian writers is psychological acuity, which I think also reflects the time. Remember, this is also the century of Freud, of Nietzsche, of William James. And so, again, not coincidentally that we see in these Russian writers this kind of very intense sort of, I would say, political kind of psychology, where, so in this case, Poprishin in the Diary of a Madman he's very put upon, he's very mocked, very abused, and he descends into insanity, and it is a depiction of the into insanity. And as I say, the really explicit connection there is between the mental health problems of the protagonist and the social status of the protagonist and the social conditions the protagonist is living in, which have broken him. And that is something that's characteristic of these people I'm calling the urban dystopians, Gogol and Dostoevsky. We'll get to Dostoevsky in a minute. These phantasmagoric magical passages in the nose, the short story, The Nose, opens up with the barber Yakovlevich in his house with his wife in the kitchen. He's cutting the bread and he finds a nose in the bread, a nose. But he recognizes the nose. The nose belongs to Major Kovalyov, who's an assessor. An assessor is a rank in the civil service. And Yakovlevich tries to throw it out, but he gets arrested. He's trying to throw it in the Neva River, which runs through the middle of St. Petersburg. And so that happens. And then we're with Major Kovalyov himself as he wakes up that morning and finds that he doesn't have a nose. It says in the story that he just has a smooth skin over where his nose used to be, in case you're wondering. And so he goes out to look for it, do stuff, and he sees his nose dressed up in a higher military rank and apparently also having the civil status of a counselor, which is higher than an assessor. He tries to follow his nose, but the nose gets away. At one point, the nose disguises itself as a doctor and gets away. But in this case, I think that Kovalyov gets distracted on the street. So what happened was, again, the czars, this was another problem for the Bourbons in France, remember, were somewhat triangulated with the landed nobility, and they understood in abolishing serfdom. They also needed to make other reforms in terms of making the nobles pay taxes and that kind of thing. So one thing that Peter the Great did was he enacted this set of rules, the table of rank. And his Enlightenment idea in the 18th century was that the table of rank would sort of replace noble status, would sort of replace title. And it would be sort of a meritocracy. But what had happened decades later was that the table of rank had also become another tremendously oppressive mechanism of establishing these hierarchies that were abused in the civil service, which was kind of everywhere. Of course, the nose could be that if you're just looking at things, you're only concerned with your superficial appearance, whereas the nose is going to tell you how things actually smell. We're going to think of someone with their nose held high as being kind of a snob, and maybe if you lose your nose, that's like losing your pride. But using these kinds of devices, again, at a very early point, Dead Souls. When I first read Dead Souls, I didn't really quite understand what the scam that Chichikov had going was, but this is what it was. So the souls are property. I mean, the serfs are property on one's estate, right? So say one is looking at things from the point of view of the privileged rich person, then one has an estate and is paying taxes on the property, the size of the property, and everything else. You have to pay taxes on the serfs. On the official papers, it was true. On the receipts and so on, serfs were referred to as souls, as in, sold 3 souls. The estate has 160 souls plus this and that. So what Chichikov does is he goes around the countryside and he finds people who have serfs who have passed away, because it was very difficult to get the papers through so that you didn't have to pay taxes on your dead serf. And Chichikov says, look, I'll buy your titles to these dead serfs for, you know, a small amount of money, but I just don't tell anybody that I'm doing it. The people in these various villages don't exactly know why Chichikov is doing that. Sometimes he does get run out of town because people think he's kind of creepy. But what he does is, when he has a bunch of titles to dead souls, he goes to a bank back in the city and says, yeah, look, these are all the serfs that I own. So I want to borrow money and use that as collateral. And then he gets a bunch of money and then he runs off. So this is his scam, is buying dead souls from these dying Russian estates. And it is a picaresque in the sense that Chichikov goes all around and he meets all different kinds of people. Poshlost is the word for sort of conformist people. And he meets sort of the greedy person, the suspicious person. He meets all these people because he's traveling around like a traveling salesman, except he's trying to buy people's dead souls. And so he meets all these people and has all these adventures. Of course, these people also are the dead souls, right? The dead souls of the people who are buying and selling these papers of dead serfs with Chichikov. Gogol, at the end of his life, he was working on this. He didn't like it. He burned the second half of it. So Dead Souls is an unfinished novel, but people often think of Dead Souls as sort of the first Russian novel. Okay, Turgenev, Ivan Turgenev. So Gogol then, who we just talked about, one of those sort of urban dystopians. Really, you know, his characters are hallucinating, cracking up under the pressure because they're starving and they're in the civil service and they're trying to get ahead. They don't have any money. Turgenev writes about the countryside. And Turgenev, the other two that we're going to look at are Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and they are both pretty in their own way. They're very different from each other, but they're very ferocious Russian nationalists. And both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky really think that part of the project is asserting and preserving the Russian identity and Russian traditions in the face of this modernizing, secular kind of amoral cultural influx from the West, from Europe. Turgenev, not so much. Turgenev is, of all these Russian writers, the one who is most sympathetic to the modern European sort of point of view. He was, again, very well educated in St. Petersburg, also in Germany. He wrote his first successful stories, among other things, portrayed injustices in serfdom. And in fact, Turgenev got first well known because his writings were used by the abolitionist movement trying to end serfdom, which was again abolished in 1862. So you got the mystical nationalists, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Turgenev is sort of the respectable one. And so the place to put Turgenev is really in the category of these great social realists of the 19th century. Victor Hugo, Charles Dickens, and others. So that was a critical and realistic epic novels of national life. And that's really what Turgenev wanted too. Turgenev also, by the way, very influenced from Cervantes. I mentioned at the beginning our presentation today that one thing about Russia is it's really got a foot in two worlds. It's really conflicted between the old and the new, for one thing. And so in that way, it's similar to the condition of Spain during Cervantes' time, and you get these same kinds of dislocations. In a talk that Turgenev gave one time, he talked about the skepticism of Hamlet and the crusading idealism of Don Quixote, and said, you know, you have to find sort of a balance. So the novel will talk about his fathers and sons. Nikolai and Pavel are liberal-minded landowners, men in their 50s, and they have an estate. They're in favor of reform. They know things have to change. And then Kirsanov, Nikolai's son, who just graduated from the university in St. Petersburg, comes out with his friend Bazarov to visit them. And the whole thing is about this generation gap, the generation gap between the younger and the older. the older ones who are the reformists, and these younger men who have just come from the university. And Bazarov, who is kind of influencing Kirsanov, they're sort of best friends. But Bazarov is a nihilist. He says he's a nihilist. That is, Bazarov is convinced that there's no such thing as morals in the world. And this is kind of a college student's caricature of the kind of cosmopolitan, of a sort of Voltaire figure. It's kind of a popular, degradation of Enlightenment ideas, that there is no such thing as value, and anyone, can, I guess, do anything. So that's upsetting to the older men. But then Turgenev shows how being out in the countryside, then again, remember, Turgenev, the sentimental nationalist, is showing that the natural forces of the Russian countryside can work their magic on people. And the two young men get involved. Bazarov falls in love with the woman. Bazarov actually eventually gets sick and passes away, but he has a spiritual awakening, emotional awakening. He's emotionally uptight, even though he's got all these radical ideas, and he gets unwound out there. And Kirsanov also realizes he has to deprogram from college. He comes back from getting saturated in those ideas, and he hangs around with his father and his uncle for a while. He says, oh yeah, Barsanov's kind of a little too cynical, a little too alienated. So, I mean, overall, the message in Fathers and Sons, I think, Turgenev tries to be very even-handed here and show that, the fathers also are not perhaps fully confronting the reality of the changes that are upon them. But, overall, really, the message here is that there are valuable things in Russian country life that ought not to be simply sacrificed to these new irreligious Enlightenment ideas. And so Fyodor Tolstoy, right? Let me just step out here, though, to say one thing that I want to say about all of these that we're looking at is Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, everybody, especially Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. A lot of these things that we're looking at are published serially. They're published serially in newspapers, and then eventually after the last episode is published, it's like TV, people want to come back every week and read their new installment, and then you publish it as a book after it's over. And so summarizing the plots of some of these novels by people like Turgenev and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, it starts to sound like a soap opera, because when you look at it from a plot point of view, that's basically what it is. It's a serial, so it's like running a show, right? You want to keep things going. And so there's a lot of twists and turns in terms of romantic attachments and that sort of thing. So, so that's something I think to remember in all of these 19th century novels, certainly true of the English and French 19th century novels as well. And you'll see that they're, 600 pages, 800 pages long, but the original readers at the time didn't sit down to an 800-page book, a giant Dickensian brick like Bleak House. These were published as serials over a long period of time. So that was something that I wanted to mention at the beginning, and I just thought I would, well, it had it on my mind, I would throw that in there. Okay, so that's Turgenev. Now, I have to say that for my money, Dostoevsky is, for me, Dostoevsky is one of the very best of all writers. That is, I mentioned, Shakespeare and Cervantes. I do really like Jonathan Swift a lot. Later on, we'll look at James Joyce. In that sort of handful of writers who I admire the most, certainly is included Fyodor Dostoevsky. I would say he's possibly one of, it's dumb, really, talk about which is the best novel, but you see what I mean. I don't think it gets a lot better than him. He is a mystic Russian nationalist. He's really pretty reactionary in his views. I had a colleague who was a Russian Jew who had grown up in Russia and Israel. And he, whenever I would mention Dostoevsky, would go, he's a terrible anti-Semite, he hated the Jews. And he is a bit of a reactionary, and he is a Christian fanatic, and there's nothing else to be said about that. Dostoevsky's one of these people you have to take warts and all, although I think I can say maybe a little bit more about that when we get to it. Something to be aware of. So one thing that happened to Dostoevsky, because of his involvement in a discussion group, and it was really because they just discussed another book that the Tsarist authorities didn't like, and he was sentenced. First, they told him that he was sentenced to death, and he was actually blindfolded and tied to a pole, and the soldiers came out with their rifles, and they were, in fact, going to execute Dostoevsky, but they got a message at the last minute not to do it. But they told him they were going to do it. But they didn't. They had sent him to hard labor in Siberia. He served a number of years in hard labor at the camp in shackles and for years. And then he was made to be a military soldier for a number of years after that. So very hard. Later in life, he had problems with his gambling. He had a major gambling addiction. If you're interested in obsessive compulsive behavior and addiction, literature of addiction, I really do recommend The Gambler from 1866, because he's got enormous powers of psychological description, and he talks about the obsession of gambling. Yeah, he's a radical Eastern Orthodox. It's the Eastern branch of Christianity. And anti-Catholic, because he thinks the Catholic Church has lost its way. Anti-constitutional republicanism, that is, he ultimately came to believe that Russian brotherly love, really in a genuinely Christian Russia, he thought, ought to be enough without any kind of constitutional government or even much of a set of laws. This kind of Russian Christian anarchism is interesting. Tolstoy has it too. We'll talk about him in a minute. And so this notion of a Christian socialism is a kind of leveling socialism, got a little fuzzy on economic details, but the idea always that you could sort of level everything out. Of course, you know, what you see in Dostoevsky's narratives are characters like the characters in Gogol who are twisted and destroyed and enter into transgression. And that question of why transgress is a central question in Dostoevsky that I want to talk about right now. These Dostoevsky and a couple of philosophers are considered forerunners of existentialism. What is existentialism? An early 20th century movement that we'll have a video on shortly, that thought that thinking of humans in terms of a sort of pre-existing essence that one then conformed to was the wrong sort of way of thinking about human nature. And that really the right way of thinking about human nature was as a sort of self-creating thing. And Dostoevsky is strikingly close to that in a particular idea that he has. And it comes out in his novel, Notes from Underground. What he says that people take as existentialist in both here and in Crime and Punishment, they're going to talk about it in a moment, is that if by doing what's conventionally right, or even doing what I think is right, if in doing that I cannot be fulfilled and I cannot express myself, I can express myself in transgression. So this fascination with transgression. In Dostoevsky, transgression is violence. Both Crime and Punishment and the brothers Karamazov have to do with murders. So this is what happens, and he's a master at describing these psychological interiors. The other thing is, I'll mention the last bullet point there, Kierkegaard argued around the same time, a little earlier, that if under Enlightenment scientific rational standards, belief in Christianity didn't make any sense, then what one had to do was not show that belief in Christianity did make sense, but rather to show that belief in Christianity was a leap of faith, a self-creative act of will. And so Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky are these kind of Christian existentialists. And ironically, because the other big one is Nietzsche, who was a self-proclaimed atheist, but he's actually dealing with exactly the same questions as Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard. So Dostoevsky plugs into this big philosophical trend that's happening in the 19th and 20th centuries. Okay, quickly then, we don't want to go on too long. Crime and Punishment, an exploration of guilt. Raskolnikov is washed out of college. He's starving. He has no money. He has no job. He has nothing, and he's alone in St. Petersburg in the city. He can't go anywhere. He can't go back to his family. And Ilyana Ivanova is a very cruel and greedy and merciless pawnbroker who has some of his things and who he owes money to. And she really doesn't care if he'll ever die. She's a terrible person. And, utilitarianism was a 19th century idea that really what was ethical was to maximize the greatest happiness. And Raskolnikov gets to thinking, and he thinks, really, this lady's terrible, and I'm a good person. I could take all her money and use it to do good things. And he does it. He acts out. He takes an axe and he goes up there and kills her. And her innocent sister, Elizaveta, who's a little bit slow, shows up, unfortunately, and he kills her too with the axe. But see, once he does this, as soon as he does that, it leaves then everything. He doesn't even take very much money, just grabs a few things. He can't even bring himself later to look and see what it is that he stole. And he runs into, so part of the genius of it is, at first, like in an Alfred Hitchcock movie, you really can't take the stress of the suspicion. His mother and his sister show up right then. They just show up. They're just going to visit. They don't know that anything's wrong. A strange older man just sort of walks up to him one day and looks at him and says, "Murderer," and kind of walks away. And one of the police investigating the case finds an old paper that Raskolnikov wrote about the Enlightenment, about nihilism and amorality, and starts to question him about that, starts to ask him questions about that. Sonia, the woman he loves, turns out to have been friends with the innocent Lizaveta who was murdered. So that's another thing. And a kind of crazy guy shows up and confesses to the murder, and he's going to take the rap for the murder. So all of these things happen and put more and more psychological pressure on Raskolnikov. But then the payoff of all that is that as terrible as it is, to be under the suspicion, to be worried with the guilt, once he realizes he's going to get away with it, the police aren't going to do anything and nobody finds out about anything. That's when it's really unbearable. And he confesses everything to Sonia, who is a Christian, and he goes to the police and confesses. And he gets sent to Siberia, and he spends about 8 years out there. At first, he hasn't really found God, and then he does. And so he gets out, comes back, and he gets to be with Sonia. The end. And the other great book is The Brothers Karamazov. If I had to name, 2 or 3 of my favorite novels in the world, The Brothers Karamazov would certainly be one of them. It's a very philosophical novel. It has long philosophical discussions. So, you sort of have to be into that kind of thing. About God, about freedom, about morality, about responsibility. Dostoevsky's 3-year-old son inherited epilepsy from Dostoevsky and had just died when the same year that he wrote The Brothers Karamazov. So he's thinking about these philosophical issues. And Dostoevsky's a very philosophical writer. I mean, he reads Hegel, he reads, he reads hardcore philosophy, actually. Now, it's a great analogical setup or metaphorical setup, because the question is, the father's been murdered, and who murdered the father? There are 3 sons. Actually, there are 4 sons, because the illegitimate son is also in the household. And each brother represents a different character that Dostoevsky wants to explore. Dmitri is a greedy sensualist like his father, fights with his father. Ivan is the college student, right? Like we saw in the other show, in the other story. He's sensitive, he's smart, but he's an atheist, he's cynical, he's kind of hopeless. Alexei is spiritual. Alexei is, of course, really the hero. it turns out he's the spiritual one. He's trying to become an Orthodox priest. And Pavel, who was raised by the servants, but he is another one of the sons, and people, and they all the other brothers, and think that he's just a dummy. They don't think much of him, but that's because they completely don't know who he really is. Polyphony in music means one thing. In prose writing, polyphony is the use of multiple points of view or multiple first-person narrations, like multiple first-person narratives for multiple characters in the text. Even sometimes jumping from one to another in short passages. It's, again, something that you see a lot in modernist novels. It's one of the things that William Faulkner does all the time. But we see Dostoevsky refining the technique in the Brothers Karamazov. In fact, at one point, Dostoevsky went and had to redo the whole manuscript because he figured out he had to frame it all in the third person in order to put in all the polyphony. So he did that. He went back and redid the whole thing. And finally, Leo Tolstoy. So we looked at Gogol, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy. Gogol and Dostoevsky, who I'm calling the urban dystopians, and Turgenev and Tolstoy, these kinds of neo-pastoralists. Although we will see now when we talk about Tolstoy that he had also very striking similarities to Dostoevsky, and it's important in terms of understanding Russian nationalism to understand them. A very high nobleman, a very high-ranking noble family with a long, long history. Bit of a dissolute life as a young man. In fact, got to be up into his 20s and 30s before he started to be a very, very serious thinker. And he went to the Crimean War, and he was an officer in the Crimean War. He was in charge of an artillery company in the Crimean War, which is significant. This happens around the same time as the United States Civil War, which is in the 1860s and ends in 1865 there. Because in both, at the time then, what you had were new mass-produced forged cannon barrels and rifle barrels and ammunition. So it was way better, way more efficient, way more accurate, way more deadly. But the officers at that time had not yet adjusted. So at this period in military history, what you have were people arraying their troops in these long lines of attack, sort of marching forward, and they were just getting mowed down. And the new artillery was very powerful, so you're just using the artillery to really kill a lot of people. Tolstoy was pretty traumatized by the war. He was not the first nor the last soldier in a war to be traumatized by it, nor officer to be, horrified by all the injustice of it. And he became a pacifist, and he was a very committed pacifist. He went to Europe and met Victor Hugo, again, the great socialist realist writer, and committed himself to social realism. Mahatma Gandhi, and this is interesting about Tolstoy, Mahatma Gandhi was very young, read an article that Tolstoy had published about pacifism and wrote to Tolstoy to ask him about it. Nowadays, the thing to look up is called Letter to a Hindu, I think. Tolstoy wrote a number of letters to Gandhi, and Gandhi said he got his pacifism from Tolstoy. And remember, Martin Luther King says he got his pacifism from Gandhi. And he did other things. He worked educating the serfs and in general for serfs' rights and things that benefited the serfs. And he was also very good about working on that for a long, long time. But he did get increasingly religious as he got older. He lived up into his 80s in the early 20th century. And he developed a kind of anarcho-pacifism, similar to Dostoevsky's. They believe that a real living Russia would be a Russia that was unified culturally and spiritually. It's totalitarian kind of Nazi stuff. I mean, okay, so just understanding that a little bit, it's blood and soil. Although and that's funny because Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky and Tolstoy are, they're very anti-government Tolstoy rejects private property, marriage. I'm not quite sure about how his rejections of marriage work, but I bet they're very much along the lines of Frederick Engels and private property of the state. And he and Dostoevsky both think that a coherent enough living Russia would have no need of a constitution, would have no need of a state. Dostoevsky, and then, mixed feelings about Tsarism too. Tolstoy also gave away most of his wealth. He had problems with his family and his marriage in the end for giving away as well. So we'll look just a couple of works by Tolstoy, and then we're done here. His great masterpiece, War and Peace. Another serial book. It goes on, very long book, sort of the stereotypically long book. Tolstoy also looked at, he's very enlightened man, and he looks at what we today would call the sort of great man tradition of history, writing history, concentrating on sort of the rulers and the leaders, the kings and the generals, and glorifying the hero. And of course, Tolstoy was all against that. And Tolstoy thought that there were large forces, large titanic forces, economic forces, cultural forces that were far beyond the control out of anyone or any party. And that made, the crime of war all the more obscene, because war was so futile. It was such a futile attempt to control things. And that made it morally so much worse. Of course, he already had been an officer, but, remember the Napoleonic Wars happened before Tolstoy was born. He did an amazing job of learning all about troop maneuvers at the time. He was quite an aficionado, actually, of the military arts, in fact, which is kind of ironic considering he was, a lifelong pacifist activist. He has 559 characters in War and Peace. Again, remember, it's something that's written as a serial. And he has a way of kind of zooming in and zooming out. I find when I'm talking about mental representation, I'm talking about books versus movies and so on, I always come to War and Peace and use that as an example. He's a very cinematic writer. He's writing almost as if he's writing for the screen. Another thing about War and Peace is, at the beginning, all the upper class Russians are all speaking French to each other. In the original manuscript, it's written in French. I mean, the readers are expected at that time, certainly, to be fluent in both Russian and French. Because Russian aristocrats all speak French. I mean, a great disruption of the Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon's decision to invade Russia was that the upper class of Russia was really a sort of a cultural colony of the high culture of Paris. And Russia saw itself as a backwards agricultural, rural kind of place. That was the stereotype. And, the French were the symbols of refinement. So then when Napoleon invades Russia and has a terrible failure, and the Russians destroy the French army. And so the way that's reflected in War and Peace, Tolstoy has all of his Russian noblemen speaking lots of French at the beginning, and gradually as the novel goes on, they speak less and less French. And by the end, they're all talking about getting back in touch with Russia and Russia. Now we're do other novels I'll mention by Tolstoy, Anna Karenina and Ivan Ilyich. Anna Karenina, how to understand it, we just talked about War and Peace, and so the theme in War and Peace is that all these people are trying to control stuff they can't control. In Anna Karenina, you have these sort of idle society people who are having affairs with each other. And Anna Karenina is having an affair with Vronsky, and Karenin, her husband, knows about it eventually. Again, it's a serial. And so it's just really the sort of novel of social manners equivalent of War and Peace, in the sense that these people also are playing these dangerous games, and these people also don't realize that they really cannot control things. And the last one is The Death of Ivan Ilyich. This was actually required when I went to high school in New York back in around 1971, 1972, around in there. It's an inevitable classic. Someone would have written it if Tolstoy had not. It's the story of the man who's lying on his deathbed thinking about his life. And Ivan Ilyich Tolstoy goes there. Ivan Ilyich realizes that he screwed up. His experience of dying is one of regret. He has realized during these weeks of lying there dying in his house that he married his wife. He didn't really care for her that much. It seemed like the right thing to do. And he's been distant from his daughter also, and they don't like him very much. But he doesn't like them very much either. But he would never have said that, except now that he's dying and it's cleared his mind. And he also realizes that with his so-called friends at work, a lot of them he's sort of stabbed in the back, and they've stabbed him in the back because he was trying to get ahead, and they were trying to get ahead. And he was only hanging out with them because he was trying to get ahead. And he realizes that was a mistake too. And so the message is, don't be Ivan Ilyich. Don't be the person sitting there dying, realizing that you threw away the most important things because you wanted conventional things, because you wanted to live the life that you were told you should want to live. Okay. So 19th century Russian literature, it's really amazing. If you like psychological literature, and if you like philosophical literature that's not afraid of a long disquisition, literature that's not afraid to follow a discussion out, literature above all that respects the intelligence of the reader. I think that's something that we've kind of lost in the last 100 years or so. The reader was expected to bring something to the table in the 19th century. I mean, you were supposed to be smart. Well, anyway, I digress. 19th century Russian literature is wonderful stuff, and there's all kinds of other interesting aspects to Russian culture as well. I certainly recommend Russian decorative arts. Really lots of fantastic stuff. The jewelry and so on is great stuff. And there's lots of other, music is amazing in Russia, so, and lots of other things. A cultural resource, I think, that a lot of people in the West don't quite appreciate for the rich resource that it is. All righty, I'll see you next week.